Hello, I will be posting my PowerPoint separately. I just didn't want to do Zoom and it not record both, so I'm going to do it both separately. So hopefully this will all make sense. So I'll be talking about the churches of God and the history of publishing. And I thought the best place to start with publishing would be, where did publishing even begin in the first place? So we can go back to Japan, and they're the first ones that made wooden type. But of course, everyone, through inventions, they make things better. So they made the movable type. Eventually, that became steel, and somewhere in there in 1450, they made the printing press in Germany. And this is where they had the movable type. So it was very easy to print things. The first thing that they printed was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, I believe. That's what it was called. So now, since things are being printed, people have they're more accessible, or can obtain information a lot easier. And through this, there was an exchange of thoughts and ideas that not just the very rich or the people that were well connected could obtain. Even normal people could obtain papers or ideas and thought, because papers were printed in the mass for now. Because before, you would just have a huge book, and only, like I said, the very rich or the very educated or the people that were going to be educated were able to have those books. So there was this exchange of thoughts and ideas that were going on now. And so that was in 1450 when the printing press was invented. And then by 1501, Pope Alexander, he promised that anyone would be excommunicated if anyone printed manuscripts without the church's permission. So now enters John Calvin and Martin Luther. As we know, Martin Luther nailed the thesis to the church's door, and this is exactly what the Pope feared. He feared that people were going to be getting their own ideas, that they're going to be able to put out their own thoughts to the masses. Then in 1605, the first newspaper was published, and this was called The Relation. So now we are going to go to the Revolutionary War. So I'm going to be talking about the Revolutionary War here just very briefly, because I think it's important to know how before religious journals were written, why exactly it was so important that this information, or maybe why the idea of information ideas were exchanged. So on the eve of the revolution, almost every colony had a weekly paper. In fact, Virginia had 3 separate weekly papers. But in these papers, everything was kind of one-sided. Everyone was kind of talking about how to bring the king down. And this is where the fight against the king could be taken to the masses. I mean, we can talk about Thomas Paine in the Common Sense. That was a huge paper during the Revolutionary War. And then, of course, we have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that were distributed through the printing press. Like I said, because of this printing press, again, this was the exchange of ideas and thought to the masses. So people were able to think for themselves, kind of for the first time, actually read other people's thoughts and then decide for themselves what they think or not think. So now enter religious journals. So religious journals, it was really interesting. So the history of religious journals started in the early 1800s, just like newspapers. So there was the Herald Gospel of Liberty, was in 1808. the Religious Remembrancer in 1813, and then the Weekly Recorder in 1814. So a lot of these religious journals were either started before some newspapers or right at the beginning stages of newspapers. And what I mean by newspapers is now there's kind of, they're not just one-sided. There's now some discourse going on here now in the newspapers. I think this way, the other person thinks this. And there's this discourse happening between the two in these newspapers. And Weinbrenner thought, and many others thought, a religious paper or journal could secure a church's place in the modern world. Because again, this is back in the 1800s. There wasn't TV, there wasn't the internet. The only way that information could be distributed was through a newspaper or word of mouth. And it seems like to me that a paper was a little bit faster than word of mouth. And again, you're getting the facts from the paper. And there was two things during this time that a paper should give and that Weinbrenner agreed on. He said a paper should give information and comment on. So it's everything that we kind of talked about before in the Revolutionary War and in the background of the printing. So religious papers should comment on religious happenings now, and they should also give information as well. And in fact, between 1792 and 1835, there were 18 newspapers that were started in Harrisburg alone. So the market was very, very saturated with newspapers because it seems like to me that people wanted to get their ideas out there. And the only way to get an idea out there was to start a newspaper. However, as we will discuss further along, subscribers are very, very important at this stage of the game. So the first newspaper that was, I'm sorry, not newspaper, but religious journal that was started was the Gospel Publisher. So there was a meeting, an eldership meeting in Middletown in 1833, and a decision was made to have a paper. Because again, in order to have a church, to secure a church in the modern world, it was important to have a religious journal or paper. So there was some delay in publishing, and the first Gospel Publisher was published 2 years later in 1835. So again, that first meeting happened in 1833, and then the Gospel Publisher was finally published in 1835. So Weinbrenner was the first editor of this paper, and he was an editor for 4 years and 8 months. So since Weinbrenner was the father of the Churches of God, he had a lot going on in that period of time. He was wearing lots and lots of different hats. So specifically here, I think Weinbrenner, he didn't really have his heart in the Gospel Publisher. He knew it was important, but it wasn't really his thing. During this time, he didn't really write very long editorials because, like I said before, his time was kind of preoccupied with forming a denomination that we now know as the Churches of God. Next, who followed Weinbrenner is, and please forgive me for this pronunciation, but I believe it's Weishampel, followed Weinbrenner. Now, just through reading, this guy is very, very interesting. But he was more of a natural with being an editor. He was more of a conversationalist, and he also wanted to take the paper to the next level. He focused more on religious news and news that was happening within the Churches of God as well. But he resigned, and then he became the printer for the Gospel Publisher. But his love for being an editor took over. To me, this is a really interesting story. So he thought he could start his own paper with a guy named Mackey, who was passed over for the editor job. So Weishampel and Mackey were brought before the eldership in 1844, and they were charged with starting what was called the Gospel Messenger. So we have the Gospel Publisher, and now we have the Gospel Messenger. So Mackey kind of, it seems like, succumbed to maybe the pressures of the eldership, but he said that Weishaupt kind of made him feel like Mackey kind of felt bad for him, and that it was only because of sympathy that he decided to go along with Weishampt's idea. So Mackey's license was renewed, but Weishaupt kind of dug his heels in and kind of said, "No, this is the paper that I started, and that was kind of and this was kind of the beginning of the end of the Gospel Publisher, but some people think that Weishaupt already saw the beginning of the end, and this is the reason why he started the Gospel Messenger." So now we come to the final days of the Gospel Publisher. So George McCartney was next in line. He was the next editor. His paper, it was less personal and it was more general. And during his tenure there were some embarrassing articles that were published, and now we had the whole mess of the Gospel Messenger going on as well. So the Gospel Publisher was then suspended in 1845. However, as I said before, there was always a need for a paper. There was always a need to somehow get the church's information, or what the churches of God, or the happenings of the churches of God, out to the masses of the people. And the best way to do that was through a publishing house or a publishing paper. So the Church Advocate was then born. In fact, in the last issue of the Gospel Publisher, it was said that a monthly magazine or monthly paper would be coming out, and that is the Church Advocate. So the Church Advocate was intended to be the only authorized paper of the church. Weinbrenner wanted this paper to be profitable because, again, it costs a lot of money to get these papers published, and there was it was long and lengthy. I can go more into it. I hope that you guys get to ask me some questions, but there was a way that people were paying for these subscriptions that wasn't really working out. So they went to like a cash system. So during this time, the paper was sold to someone else, to James Colder, in 1857. Some people wanted the paper to be moved west to Ohio region. But again, Weinbrenner just, above all else, just wanted this paper to be profitable. And then eventually in 1913, it is said that the Church Advocate was profitable. And it was because of this now that other publishing or other papers could then be published. And the Church Advocate is now called the Global Advocate. It has survived since 1845. So with, like I said, because of the Church Advocate, other papers were able to start. And one of those papers was the Sunday school paper, the Gem. There was a want and a need for Sunday school material, but they first had to get subscribers first. But there was the people that wanted to get this published felt that it was needed. So they only got about half of the subscribers, and they still published. And then by 1909, they were publishing about 5,000 copies, which is kind of impressive, in my opinion, in that time, to get 5,000 booklets across. And then some other papers that were published were the Monthly Preacher. So it is said, from what I was reading in Forney, that if Weinbrenner would have lived longer, that this would have been a system of theology for the church. And I would argue that it maybe still kind of is, because within these papers, he talked about the ordinances. He talked about actual happenings, theological matters of the day through his sermons. And again, this is Weinbrenner thought at that time a paper was to comment on and to give out information. So Weinbrenner was giving information about the churches of God to other people that could read his sermons, other information. And then we had this Sunday School Record, but this failed because there was a loss of subscribers, and the Workman Quarterly, which was more Sunday School material. So like I said before, these papers kind of, you lived or died by the subscriber. If there were no subscriptions, then what was the point of having a paper? This was a time that was before yellow journalism, which was sensationalism. So that kind of yellow journalism started in the 1890s. These were straight facts that were being played out in real time. And these were the papers where arguments could play out civilly, where people commented on issues or happenings back and forth in the papers, and people were waiting to see what each other would say. And again, people were getting the facts straight from a source. They weren't getting it from word of mouth. So it was very important, it seems like, to kind of keep the headlines interesting, but at that time you could only keep the headlines as interesting as what was truly going on in either the religious world or the secular world. There wasn't a celebrity culture in order to sell newspapers. So as I was reading this, I kind of wondered, no wonder why so many papers were started in Harrisburg, because there was so much happening, or people thought their ideas, they just wanted to get their ideas out there into the world for other people to read, so people could comment on and get feedback maybe. And then I just want to talk about how there is room today to inform and comment on. I think it's but in a civil and factual way, in print. I've listed 3 names here. David French from The Dispatch, Christianity Today, and I listen to, and it's not print, but again, we have, in today's culture, or in today's world rather, we have more than just print options to look at. We have podcasts, we have YouTube videos, we can look up any sermon online. Any church can get their information out there and accessible to us. So one podcast that I mentioned was Dirty Rotten Church Kids. This is a podcast that most of us probably wouldn't want to listen to, but I think there is a need for us today to listen to what is going on the other side, and to not get angry, but to know the information, what the other side is thinking about. So what this other side is that I'm referring to is how people deconstruct, and how people are turning away from the church, and the reasons why people are turning away from the church. I think it would be very beneficial today for us to, have some discourse back and forth, and so we can learn from each other. But the publishing, if it weren't for Weinbrenner to, I think, start the paper with to inform and comment on, I think it's just as important back then as it is as important today. Because everyone has an opinion, but unless that opinion is backed up by facts, and actual scripture and theology, there's kind of no value in that. So, and I think it's important for us to hold each other accountable, which is what the papers did back then as well. I mean, we read about Warner, we read about Weinbrenner and Neville, and how their arguments played out in the paper for everyone to see. So that was my presentation. I hope that we get to have some questions, but again, thank you so much.